Okay, this is February the 2nd, 2009. We're with Jerry Gewe, Gewe. Jerry retired from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power some years ago and represented the interests of the city of Los Angeles on the Colorado River Board for a number of years. So, Jerry, thanks very much for agreeing to sit down with us today as part of the Colorado Rivers Board's Oral History Project. Why don't we start out with a little bit of your background so people know where you're coming from and where your water wisdom comes from?
Okay.
How did you get into this business?
Well, I started out as a civil engineering student at Cal Poly Pomona, where I graduated in 1967. Went to work for the city of Los Angeles after looking at DWR, but found they were downsizing as the state aqueduct was finishing. And the Hollywood District Office of City of LA wanted me on their basketball team. That's how important decisions are made. But I spent 38 years with the city of Los Angeles in varied capacities, starting off with the Department of Public Works, and then moving over to Department of Water and Power in 1973. In Department of Water and Power, I went through the ranks from associate engineer, entry level supervisory engineer, dealing with hydraulics and the distribution, dealing with customers. From there, I went into working with the aqueduct system, starting on the Owens Valley groundwater issues, and then moving into taking over the aqueduct operations. I spent a period of time in the water operating division, developing engineering plans for the construction forces to work with, and then moved into the front office to work on implementation of computers into the system. And that's where the drought of 1990 hit. And being available in the front office without specific duties, I became Mr. Drought, or Manager for Water Conservation Los Angeles. From there, moved into the broader water resources issues, and finally ended up as the Assistant General Manager for Department of Water and Power and the head of the water system.
So you obviously spent some time, or apparently spent some time in the Owens Valley, as many DWP people have, or did you do that work from LA?
My involvement was strictly from Los Angeles. I was responsible for some of the groundwater issues, but did the analysis and all from Los Angeles, and also responsible for the actual operations from Los Angeles. Actually, there was a point in time where Jim Wixer wanted me to go up to the Owens Valley as his successor in charge of the Owens Valley operations. But Dwayne Jorgensen, who was his boss at the time, decided to keep me local and do the computerization work. And after living on the fence for a year, where am I going to Bishop or am I not, I said, I've had enough. I need to get on with my life, find somebody else.
Well, since you're obviously familiar with the Owens Valley, before we get into Colorado River issues, and this one is somewhat related because the one of the answers to the question is going to be that LA became more dependent on the Colorado River and Metropolitan Water District. What were your thoughts at the time that DWP was negotiating to take less water from the Owens Valley and leave more water in the valley, primarily for Owens Dry Lake and other purposes? Did that concern you at the time, or?
It certainly did. Probably I need to go back a little bit more in history to before the Owens Lake settlement, because the issues in the Owens Valley are complex and up and down and so on and so forth. Historically, Los Angeles developed its water supply under Mulholland turn of the century from the Owens Valley, and had a very stable water supply from the Owens Valley through the 1960s. A couple of droughts in there affected things and came into play with the Metropolitan Water District being formed, but essentially the Owens Valley system was Los Angeles' backbone water supply through the 1960s. As we saw a balanced need between expanding the Owens Valley or expanding our take of the Metropolitan Water District in the 60s, the city of Los Angeles made the decision to augment the Los Angeles Aqueduct with the second Los Angeles Aqueduct, which increased capacity by about a third. And at that point in time, then some of the Owens Valley issues came to the front. We peaked out taking water from the Owens Valley in the 1970s, where at that point in time, 80% of the Los Angeles supply was coming from the Owens Valley. And then we started falling under CEQA. And CEQA determinations that gradually started taking away our ability to use the groundwater from the Owens Valley, reducing our supply, although it took 20 years to really reach fulfillment of the legal system. And then in the late 1990s, we moved into issues involving the dust off of Owens Lake, and again continued to lose water from the Owens Valley system, to whereas today the take from the Owens Valley system is about half of what it was back in the 1970s, which is actually less than the capacity of the original aqueduct in typical years, although we still have the capacity to take out large quantities in really wet years.
So you lost not only water, but you also generate, or DWP generated, or does generate power from that system as well. And so they lost some of that power, I presume.
That is correct. The Owens Valley system is unique in the fact that it is the only major aqueduct system that actually generates power as the water comes to Los Angeles and Southern California, versus the Colorado River system and the state system, which uses substantial quantities of power to pump the water into Los Angeles or Southern California. It was interesting, back in the 1960s, the city was evaluating whether they should rely upon Metropolitan Water District or whether they should expand their aqueduct system in Los Angeles. The decision makers were presented the fact that it was about a break-even cost effectiveness between the two alternatives. And the city leadership decided to augment the Owens Valley system because they wanted control over their own destiny rather than being dependent on an outside organization. It turned out in the 1970s, with the cost of oil going up, with the value of power going up, that the aqueduct system paid for itself every 3 years in the 70s in terms of the capital cost that was invested in it. So our ability to forecast future costs and returns is somewhat limited.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Now, obviously you weren't with the Department of Water and Power in 1928. You weren't even born in 1928. But I suspect that during your career at DWP, you acquired some knowledge of the history. And one of the interesting tidbits from back in those days was that DWP, of course, predates Metropolitan Water District. And my recollection is that the city of LA had an entitlement or an agreement for some amount of Colorado River water that ultimately was turned over to MWD when LA became a member of Metropolitan Water District. Can you talk about that, the birth of Metropolitan there?
As I understand it, and as you say, I wasn't there, but I have seen a number of the records from back in that point in time, and read some of the history of that in those early years. Mulholland in the early 1920s became concerned that the aqueduct system, which when he designed it, the aqueduct system from the Eastern Sierra, which when he designed it he thought would last for 50 to 100 years, was in fact not necessarily even capable of meeting the demands at the end of the 1920s, given the drought conditions that were being experienced up in the Owens Valley in the early 1920s. And as such, he started looking for additional ways of augmenting Los Angeles' supply. And I believe it was 1922 that actually Los Angeles went out under Mulholland's direction and did the feasibility study for the original Colorado River aqueduct system, and had an alignment that was substantially similar to what actually was built by Metropolitan Water District at the late 20s and 30s. At that point in time, I believe it was 24, although I'm not positive of the date, Los Angeles actually went and filed with the state board for 1,500 cubic feet per second of supply from the Colorado River, which is about 1.1 million acre feet a year. So Los Angeles had an early filing upon the Colorado River system prior to the existence of the Metropolitan Water District. Again, my understanding, although I do not have firm documentation, is that Mulholland took his conceptual plans back to New York bankers and said, we need some money to make this happen. And they looked through his plans and said, you don't have a strong enough financial base in order to give us the confidence that we're going to get paid back. Therefore, you need to find a broader base to spread this project over if you want our support and funding for the project. And that was really the genesis of the Metropolitan Water District, that Mulholland had to find a way of broadening it, and therefore went out to the other cities in Southern California, in Los Angeles County actually, and said, we all are going to need future water supplies. Let's work together to make it happen. LA will provide the bulk of the backing, and in those early years they paid way over 80% of the funds that went in Metropolitan Water District, but also agreed to limit the political influence that the board of directors had from Los Angeles, so that the other cities could have a say in how it got spent. And working together came up with the concept, got approval from the state legislature in Sacramento, and the Metropolitan Water District was formed. Now, Los Angeles had filed for the 1,500 CFS of water, but they never actually took the steps to move it from a filing or an application into a license, which occurs when you actually utilize the water under the California Water Rights System. So the filing was left on the books but Los Angeles actually perfected the water rights. As I understand it, in the 1960s, a general manager looked at the fact that we were spending money every year to keep that application going and said, Los Angeles will never, need to take that water on its own. You've got the Metropolitan Water District's aqueduct. Los Angeles has the rights to, at that point, I think about 60% of the water from Metropolitan under the preferential rights. There's no point in paying money every year to keep this license going, and Los Angeles dropped their license application for the water from the Colorado River.
Oh, well, that's interesting. They didn't drop it until the '60s. Then it had nothing to do with the direct origins of Metropolitan Water District in 1928.
No. In essence, the Metropolitan Water District was able to go ahead and take over that filing because there was no competing filing at that point going for it. And so they built it, and LA just never pushed it. Versus I never saw any documentation that LA said we're giving up this filing. As I say, until the '60s when LA stopped paying the fees on the filing.
The city of San Diego also had a right to Colorado River water, which they gave up when they joined the district during late stages of World War II. Were those two filings, San Diego and Los Angeles, were they analogous or were they different kinds of filings?
I'm not positive on the filing. You'll notice if you go back to the Colorado River Compact, that both Los Angeles and San Diego were given federal rights to the river as a Category 5, I think it was, right, below Metropolitan Water District and the ag agencies, of equal value or equal priority in the system. Now, I'm not sure whether San Diego had filed for the same quantity or lesser quantities. The quantity that we received was not as large as that original LA filing. So I'm not quite sure of the tie there. But San Diego, of course, never perfected their right because they never built a system. So they're similar in terms of the fact, at least under California law. Again, federal law and California law are not necessarily identical here. But under California law, neither LA nor San Diego actually took the steps to make it permanently into a water right.
Okay. When then, within your career at DWP, when did you really become engaged with Colorado River issues? I know that you sat on the Colorado River Board for some number of years, and being one of the top managers on the water system side, you certainly had to be concerned about what was going on with Colorado River water because some of that would flow to DWP at some point in time. At what stage in your career did you really jump into the Colorado River?
Well, I'd really been largely into the nuts and bolts engineering, actually, doing projects until the late 1980s, when I got moved into the executive office, as I say, to implement computerization within the water system. And it was really at that point in time when the drought of 1990 hit that I started getting involved in the broader water supply, water policy issues. And obviously, there was a huge tie between water conservation and the water supplies in the short term of the drought and the long-term policies of the Metropolitan Water District. And so at that point, I basically moved into the primary staff liaison with the Metropolitan Water District. And since at that point in time, virtually all of Metropolitan's water was coming from the Colorado River, obviously that put me into Colorado River issues. It's kind of interesting, in 1991, I believe it was, where Metropolitan Water District was trying to make their plans for the year, and the state said, well, this year you got a 20% allocation. At least that's the number I remember. I'm not positive it's right. And by the way, you've already taken it at the end of January. So therefore, at that point, we were 100% dependent upon the Colorado River. Now, fortunately, we had some March miracle, a little more rain came, and they were able to get a little more water out of the state project. But clearly, the Colorado was extremely important to Los Angeles as well as the rest of Southern California at that point.
Did you ascribe to the theory that when Metropolitan became a partner in the State Water Project, that was going to be the water supply for the future, because it was known that MWD would be losing some of its Colorado River, not its Colorado River water, but some Colorado River water that it had been using. What were your thoughts with respect to the State Water Project and its impact on Southern California's water supply at the time?
Again, I'm looking back on history. I was not involved in the 60s in the water policy aspects. But interestingly enough, as I did research some of the issues in preparation with some of the activities within Metropolitan Water District, I found that Los Angeles had actually opposed Metropolitan Water District entering into the contract with the state project. on the grounds that under the preferential rights, Los Angeles had the rights to a very substantial portion of the Colorado River water that was available to MWD, and they did not feel that they should, as an NMD, be paying the increased cost to get the water all the way down to San Diego. They felt that they could live very well on just the Colorado River apportionment for a long period of time, and in reality, wanted San Diego to have to contract directly with the State Water Project and not involve Los Angeles funding in supporting San Diego. Now, the Chambers of Commerce of San Diego and LA got heavily involved in the middle of it, as well as Governor Brown putting a lot of pressure on. And at the end of the day, Los Angeles caved and supported the metropolitan contract with the State Water Project. But the initial concept was that LA could live on what was then its entitlement to the Colorado River through MWD for a long period of time, particularly not picturing the amount of loss they were going to have in the Owens Valley for environmental concerns. And so the State Project was not looked upon as the savior of Los Angeles, it was looked on as the savior of the rest of Southern California.
Oh, very good. Well, that's some interesting background. What were when you began representing DWP or sitting in with Colorado River Board regarding DWP's points of view? What were your initial thoughts about what was going on the Colorado River at that time, as you sat on that board, which is a policy-making board, after all?
Right.
And why were you there, by the way? Why were you on the board?
Okay. The Colorado River Board, even though Los Angeles had no direct rights, in the same way as San Diego has, or at least no direct water, we had rights under the Colorado River Compact. But both of us had seats on the Colorado River Board. Also, Los Angeles had a power interest in Colorado River water because earlier on they actually operated the power plant at Parker there and at Hoover. Yeah, or I mean, sorry, just the one at Hoover. But they operated that power plant at Hoover, and it was a huge backbone of Los Angeles, which of course also helped finance all the facilities under the Depression because of the power that came out of it. It was really power ratepayer dollars that built a lot of the facilities at Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam itself was financed basically on the ability of the power bonds to provide revenue for that facility. So Los Angeles had had a role on the Colorado River issues, but it had been substantially downplayed over the decades. I actually got involved in the board level actions probably somewhere 2000-ish, maybe 1998, 99. I don't remember the exact year there. And at that point, of course, we were really working through Metropolitan Water District. Now, one of the things Los Angeles is very cognizant of is, as goes Southern California, so goes Los Angeles. And we are a linked economy. If one part of Southern California is hurting, it's going to spread over into the rest. Our economies are so linked together that we can't be an island unto ourselves. And as such, the perspective of Los Angeles was do everything we can do to make the region successful. And obviously, Colorado River water was very important to the region as a whole. So our main focus was let's maintain the water for all of Southern California without looking at specifically how many drops get to Los Angeles. But at the same time, economically, we wanted to make certain that Los Angeles did not have to pay more than its appropriate share of the costs that was required to get the water to Los Angeles.
What would you say, if there were any, primary controversies? And I don't mean that with a capital C, but if everyone agreed on everything, then we'd only need one guy, and the board, and the board has more than one. So what was going on the board during your term where LA may have had some issues with some of the other entities, whoever they may have been, or expand that a little bit, if necessary. What was going on with the Colorado River Board of California as it relates to Arizona, Nevada, the lower basin states?
Well, as I came into the board, we were really getting into, maybe the board had been there a little while, but essentially facing the reality that in the not too distant future, the availability of water supply to California was going to have to be reduced. That California had been using supplies that ultimately would go to other states, Arizona, maybe a little bit, but mostly the northern states. And as such, we were going to have to eventually come down to our 3.4 allotment. And so most of the issues we're dealing with the question of how do we, as a state, come down to that allotment, and then what is the appropriate sharing of the pain economically and water supply wise between the agricultural agencies and Metropolitan Water District, which in turn, of course, affected LA in terms of water we would get.
You said 3.2. Did you mean California's entitlement was 4.4? That include the ag agencies?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've lost a lot of the numbers.
Okay, well, that's all right. I just
So,
wanted.
but yeah, no, it is basically California was been taking 5 plus and had to get down to 4.4.
Okay, I didn't want someone to think at
Right.
some point that we gave away 1.2 million
No,
feet of
no.
water. But, I'm going to put this on pause because I want to raise this camera just a little bit. So hold
Okay.
that thought. Okay, we've adjusted the camera here. Jerry, we were talking about essentially controversies going on with respect to Colorado River water while you were on the board. But one of the enduring issues at Metropolitan as it relates to all water supplies available to Southern California is the issue of preferential rights, which I understand predates you as part of the Metropolitan Water District Act. But LADWP, and I recall you personally, worked very hard to retain the concept of preferential rights. And what I'd like you to talk about is what are they, and why has GWP hung on to them so vociferously when they've never been implemented, and many people think never will be. So the basic question here is let's talk about preferential rights and how shortages on the Colorado River play into that.
Okay, preferential rights is a fairly complex issue and has a whole lot of components to it. But in the essence, it is that under the act that initially set up Metropolitan Water District, one of the provisions was that in the event of shortage, where Metropolitan Water District could not meet the desires of all of its customers, the water would be allocated in proportion to the investments made within Metropolitan Water District, excluding the funds paid in for the purchase of water. And that's a summary of the language that's actually in the act. The idea was that at the time Metropolitan was set up, LA was putting in almost all the capital, 80+%.
We're going back to 1928, 29.
34, whatever it was there when you actually started building it.
Okay.
The Los Angeles was putting in virtually all of the money for building the facilities, but was getting absolutely zero water because the aqueduct system from the Eastern Sierra was providing all the water needed. Los Angeles was looking out to the future as backing up its aqueduct when a shortfall took place, not the need for water at the time that the aqueduct system for Met, the Colorado River aqueduct system, was being constructed. And so in order to protect its investment, it had pushed through, if you will, the provision that when water was needed, that it would go in proportion to the investment that was made in Met. And that worked. The concept we held pretty solid for the length of time that Met only had Colorado River water. However, as the metropolitan system expanded to include the purchase of water from the State Water Project, that then made things a little bit more complex. How should that play into it? Particularly as you moved from the point where all of the capital costs of Met were paid for out of taxation in the early years to where the water rate itself was paying a fairly substantial proportion of the capital costs. And so that then led to questions over what's the definition of terms and is it reasonable to exclude the sale of water from the investments that were made in Met. Again, the act was very specific, but the concepts behind it were they identical to how it was being implemented, in the 1990s. Generated a lot of controversy, particularly between Los Angeles and San Diego, who were at the polar opposites of the investment spectrum. Again, the preferential rights indicated that when Met was short, that the water would go to the person who'd made the investment.
In proportion to
the
size.
investment made. It was under active discussion, shall we say, in the drought of the 1970s, 76, 77, where Los Angeles actually went into rationing. Metropolitan Water District did not. Los Angeles went into rationing to protect its water supplies from the Eastern Sierra. The Eastern Sierra supplies, again, are essentially an almost zero incremental cost supply. And the court said, Los Angeles, if you're going to have access to that water in the Eastern Sierra causing environmental issues, you've got to share the pain by making certain that your citizens are using it wisely, and basically push Los Angeles into rationing, even though there was enough water in Southern California that Los Angeles could have gotten it from Metropolitan Water District to maintain its normal demands. At that time, as I understand it, the city attorney of Los Angeles said that Los Angeles could prevail under preferential rights and could in fact take the water from Met, or could require Met to provide the water should Los Angeles need it. I understand the attorney from Metropolitan Water District had a different opinion at that point in time, but it never got pushed to resolution. When we came into the drought of the 1990s, the city attorney of Los Angeles was less secure in their position that Los Angeles really had an enforceable right, and looked heavily at the state water code section, which said something to the essence of notwithstanding proportional rights. Didn't use the word preferential, but proportional rights, which are similar to what the LA rights were based upon, that the board of directors had the ability to allocate water to meet the health and safety needs of the customers. And the LA city attorney basically took the stance that in a drought, it was highly questionable whether LA could really depend upon those preferential rights. On the other hand, I understand the Met attorney at that point in time said, well, we're not sure. We think maybe Los Angeles could sort of reverse the roles there. But again, we did not get down to taking it to court because Los Angeles agreed to a political settlement, the IIRP, or whatever the acronyms were at the time, where we basically allocated water based on the use in the last year and conservation adjustments and so on and so forth, that allowed us as a region to get through that drought in a manner that kept everybody reasonably whole.
Is it fair to call that a political accommodation?
It was clearly a political accommodation, again, made in the interests of maintaining the economy of Southern California. Los Angeles, again, had that big picture. We don't want to destroy San Diego and South Orange County because in turn that will flash back into LA. We need to work together to maintain the economy of the entire region.
Go ahead.
Now, after the drought was over, then San Diego said, well, you haven't used it in the last two droughts. Why do you even want it? Let's just get rid of it. And the Los Angeles political leadership said, hey, wait, we have invested extremely heavily in Met over the years. We've gotten very little water by comparison. Under preferential rights, Los Angeles had something like 26% of the water supply from Met at that time, but San Diego had 11 or 12. And the actual take of water was, of course, exactly the opposite. And so Los Angeles said, no, we're not willing to give up that preferential right. We agree that we should look at it and possibly change the basis of it. And we agree that it probably will not apply during a drought situation. But Southern California is going to keep growing. And as we lose access to water in the Colorado, as we lose access to the Owens Valley water, Los Angeles, in a non-emergency, non-drought situation, may want 3 or 4% more water than what we're looking at. Well, San Diego, was wanting the same water. We think that a court could legitimately find that Los Angeles has the right to that water in a non-emergency situation. Therefore, San Diego, if you want that water, you need to work with us and find a rational basis for which we can, in fact, get a return on the investment we've made. Now, I put forward on behalf of the city a proposal that Dwayne Jorgensen had cooked up a decade before, basically saying we would agree that the preferential rights should be based not just on taxes, because we understand that the sale of water is providing a significant portion of capital today, but basically let's make it based on the total investment in Metropolitan Water District capital facilities. However, because Los Angeles put most of their investment in the 1940s and 50s when a dollar was worth a dollar, we believe that the actual input should be adjusted to reflect the inflation that's taking place between times. So Los Angeles said we would accept a formula for the allocation of water in non-emergency situations that is based on the total capital invested in Met, adjusted for inflation. And then we would use that the basis updated regularly and use that as the basis of distributing water in a shortfall other than emergency conditions.
And what happened to that?
We had a couple of rounds of discussions. I had some interest from a couple members from San Diego. Had one fairly serious bargaining session with Bob Campbell, Brian Thomas, and myself, where we were looking at some of the numbers. But at the end of the day, my personal belief is that San Diego found it far more beneficial to them to complain about the unfairness of the preferential rights than to solve it. Now, what we actually even offered was one step further, is that in the case of the shortfall, that the water would go to need and the money flow to the person who had paid the equity, so that San Diego wouldn't get caught totally short. in a shortfall. But since they were getting the water without any additional cost, it really wasn't in their interest to resolve it.
Okay, and just for the record, Bob Campbell was a finance guy with the San Diego County Water Authority, and Brian Thomas was the CFO, Chief Financial Officer at Metropolitan Water District.
That is correct.
So, uh, let's talk a little bit about how long did you serve on the Colorado River Board?
I was on the Colorado River Board either as an alternate as a member for probably 6 years or so. When David Freeman took over as general manager and Jim Wixer, who had been the Colorado River Board member, went into retirement, David Freeman was appointed to the member position on the Colorado River Board representing Los Angeles, and I was listed as his alternate. I think David Freeman made one meeting, and I attended all the rest of them on behalf of the city of Los Angeles. And then when David Freeman left DWP after about 3 years, I then was appointed the actual member on the Colorado River Board. I served there until I retired.
And within that time frame, what can you recall? What are some of the major discussions or issues that came up, either inter or intrastate, that were occurring during that period of time? I mean, we had the multi-species habitat conservation plan, we had the drought, we had all kinds of stuff going on. What stands out in your mind as really important stuff?
Well, the really important stuff was, all of the discussions that ultimately ended up into the quantification settlement. It involved a whole lot of different pieces, but basically, how do we find a way to get California down to its allotment, and how do we time these things such that the other states feel comfortable that they're going to get there, and that they're not going to be imposed upon by California's political strength at such time as an actual emergency shortfall occurs. And so you had, reevaluation of the hydrology. You had various operating scenarios. You had operational plans for Hoover and, my mind went blank, but the other reservoir up north of Hoover.
Lake Powell?
Powell. And how do we relate the two of them there? So all of these issues were coming into play in terms of trying to get to the point. And then, of course, within that is how are we going to get California to live within its allotment, and how do we come up with a reasonable apportionment of water between the ag agencies and the urban agencies to meet the needs of both segments of our society. And so they all melded together in terms of finally coming together with a quantification settlement that was approved, just about the time or a little before I retired.
The various entities in California that were party to the quantification settlement agreement, QSA, they seem to be getting along better now. Is that my imagination, or do you feel the same way? And if so, was the QSA the linchpin that got them to be a little nicer to each other?
Again, I have not really been in the middle of these issues for the 4 years since I've retired, so I can't say if they're getting along better today. But certainly, I think the QSA gave a basis for a comfortable relationship. When you're not fighting for something that's very important to your survival, you can certainly relate better. And when you have a baseline to work from, the QSA basically provided the baseline. Here's where it's going to be long term, and how do we get there? So that we may need to make adjustments, but it's not the same as when you're arguing over what is the baseline going to be. And so I'm sure the QSA was very instrumental in allowing the agencies then to relate better to each other and to work together towards the common good to make certain that we get the total quantity coming to California versus, what share of the pie am I going to get?
I want to take you back. You mentioned Hoover Dam much earlier in this interview, and I'd like to take you back there because I think a lot of people really don't understand what Los Angeles's impact was on the construction of Hoover Dam. If it hadn't been for LA, there wouldn't be a Hoover Dam. Can you talk a little bit about the power resource that LA gets from Hoover?
Okay. Again, I'm going to go back to the 30s when the concept of the Colorado River Aqueduct was being formulated and the partnership was being developed with the federal government to fund Hoover Dam, that in turn would make possible the filling of an aqueduct, bringing the water from the Colorado to Los Angeles. A significant linchpin was the power sales to Southern California. And of course, Los Angeles was by far and away the largest, although the other municipalities in Southern California also had smaller shares of the power coming out of the Colorado River and out of Hoover Dam. Basically, it was the agreement of Los Angeles, along with the smaller amounts from the other cities, that formed the linchpin of the financing. That the federal government could say, this is a project we can go ahead with. These people are going to be paying off the bonds. They're utilized for the construction of the dam, or at least the power component, which was a fairly large percentage of the cost of the dam, to allow the federal government to put their dollars into it. And during the first 50 years of operation, DWP actually ran the generating facility at Hoover Dam, and then I believe it was the late 70s or early 80s, after the 50-year period ran out, the Bureau of Reclamation took over the operation directly. Most of the employees were given the choice of coming back to Los Angeles or joining the Bureau of Reclamation and retiring, and a very large portion chose to retire at that point, having been around for significant portions of their career. And then the Bureau of Reclamation now currently is the one who operates that facility. But again, it was the dollars that were promised by Los Angeles. At the time that Hoover Dam came online, my memory is, and I'm not sure the numbers are correct, was that almost 80% of the power of Los Angeles at that period of time actually came out of Hoover Dam. It was a very, very significant portion of our power ability there back in the 40s. Today, while it's significant dollar-wise to us, it is something like 6% or 5% of the power of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has grown so much in its energy usage that Hoover Dam is a very small component in comparison with the coal-fired plants and the nuclear plants, and so on and so forth, that are providing electricity to Los Angeles. The one factor that Los Angeles lost when they lost the operational capability at Hoover is Los Angeles had been able to peak off of the power from Hoover Dam, so that when you got into this Friday afternoon and all the air conditioning is on, they could turn on the generators and control the distribution there to help Los Angeles with its peaking needs. Whereas after Los Angeles lost control of the operations, then all that went over to the Bureau of Reclamation and basically became pretty much a steady state flow into Los Angeles. So the peaking capability was taken away.
This may be an unfair question. You might not even be able to answer it, but I'll throw it out there anyway. In order to generate power, you have to release water through the generators, which means you're subtracting water from the reservoir. So from a water management standpoint, you might want to hold that water in the reservoir, and from a power production standpoint, you're forced to release the water from the reservoir to spin the turbine. Were there ever discussions, heated discussions within LADWP over the water and the power components, or was that reasonably well coordinated?
It was basically coordinated by policy that had been worked out decades ago. On the Owens Valley system, where it's actually much more significant than on the Hoover Tower, it was understood from the very beginning that it was basically built for the purpose of water. The Owens Gorge power plants actually weren't added, didn't come online until 1959. And part of the agreement of the power system putting it in was the fact that they would give operational control of the flows to the water system. So yes, it could have an impact, substantial impact on power costs and so on and so forth. The basic final say was with the water system. On the other hand, when I was in charge of economic operations, I would talk at least weekly and sometimes daily with the power operators and say, okay, now where are you at? Where are we at? How can we work together to accomplish the common good for the ratepayer, who is the same person for both of us? And so we did coordinate very closely and I think quite well. But if at the end of the day push came to shove, there are other places you could buy electricity. The ability to get water was much less available than that of the power.
Okay, so on either system, the Owens Valley system or the Colorado River, you would say that water, the delivery of water, and keeping water in storage for the next drought is always the priority.
I can't say for certain how the Bureau operates Hoover today, but certainly on the aqueduct system of Los Angeles and the Eastern Sierra, it was definitely that way, and I assume it is the same on the Colorado River system and Hoover Dam, that the water needs would take precedent over the power, because again, you do have more alternatives on the power side than you have on the water side.
We've been talking about the past. Let's talk about the future. I mean, you're a well-experienced water manager type guy. We know that Metropolitan has lost a substantial amount of water on the Colorado River, and now we know today, February 2009, that the State Water Project is somewhat in jeopardy for environmental reasons, demand reasons, drought reasons, or whatever. Uh, what are your thoughts about the water outlook for Southern California for, say, the next 5 or 10 years, and maybe even beyond that? I mean, some people think that we're in trouble.
Again, you have to look at the different time frames differently, probably, because it takes so long to change the water resource. You can't just all of a sudden go out and say, okay, here's some new water. It just isn't there. So I could see us having some fairly significant issues in the next few years. Another dry year like this year is turning out, and throw one more year on top of this, and you're likely going to see some pretty significant shortfalls in urban Southern California, without question. On the other hand, one wet year can make up for several dry years, and could go on another decade without a significant interest. So we don't know exactly what the time frame is of water supply. On the other hand, I see the state of Southern California, in particular, looking at a concept that we certainly pushed, and Ruth Galanter, when she was chair of our committee at the LA City Council, pushed from the beginning when she took it over, and that's basically sustainability. That we have to be able to bring ourselves closer to living within the supplies that are generated locally. What we tried to base our planning around at DWP when I was there was the fact that we were never going to import more water than what we had imported in the late 90s. We said that's the peak. At that point, it was very high levels of import. We're going to try and operate our system, develop new supplies such that we do not have to import more water than we imported at that point in time. And we're pretty successful at it with our conservation programs, where consistently we were getting 15% less per capita use by our customers coming out of the drought than what they were using before. And with a goal of implementing substantial water conservation or water recycling, we felt that we could, in fact, over time, generate the supplies to keep the economy of Los Angeles whole, meet the growth. It was pretty well demonstrated by the fact that when I retired in 2005, we were still using less water than we had used in the late 1980s, going into the previous drought, despite an increase of 25% population in the city of Los Angeles. So we demonstrated that the model could work. Unfortunately, the politics and just the difficulties of generating supply inhibited us from getting our water recycling programs to where we had wanted them to be. I was within a week of starting up the East Valley project, which would have taken 10,000 acre feet a year of highly treated wastewater from the Tillman treatment plant in San Fernando Valley, recharging the groundwater basin, and utilizing that as a base component of supply when the politics blew up in our face and the project was unable to get off the ground. I believe that project will get started in the next 5 to 10 years. There'll be more treatment than what we had provided for at that time. But clearly, I think Southern California is moving toward the direction has been spearheaded by Orange County, that we're going to have to use our water more than once to meet our long-term economic needs for water in Southern California. The other area that may become part of the long-term picture, although the current political leadership in Los Angeles is frankly opposed to it, is desalination. I had proposed and was pushing forward with a pilot project on a relatively small scale, 10,000 acre feet a year type order of magnitude, at Scattergood Generating Station, where it would serve the water in the local area there, where you had one pressure zone and minimal of capital investment required, utilizing the heat from the steam, or the steam, excess steam from the generating station to help out, and then using reverse osmosis. We felt that we could, frankly, at a cost not hugely above some of the more expensive water recycling projects, generate desalinated water, again, for service in the area right along the coast there. As you try to move it inland, it's going to get much more expensive as you get the distribution costs. Our systems are built to bring water from the mountains to the ocean, not the ocean to the mountains. And so you're going to have to make substantial investments in your distribution systems to be able to utilize that source of water. However, when you look at the cost, desalinated water may be 2 to 3 times the cost of buying water from the Metropolitan Water District. But the cost of water from the Metropolitan Water District is only 25-30% of the total water bill to a customer. So even though you may triple the cost of a component of the water, overall, when you consider the value of water, it's doable if we make the decision we want to do it.
So the primary concern, political concern today at the city level is cost?
No, the concern are probably twofold. Number one is there is some concern that we have not studied enough to understand the potential environmental consequences of doing it. So you got an environmental concern there. And number two is if we start doing that, that would let the city off the hook from doing the water recycling, which is seen as a less environmentally impactful alternative for potentially similar costs. I mean, when you get into the water recycling, is not going to be cheap. The easy projects have already been done. And so as you go to expand it, which the city is now talking about spending billions of dollars expanding the recycling, the costs, aren't going to be that much different than if you did desalination. But the feeling is that if you started doing desalination now, everybody would jump to that and you wouldn't get the recycling done, which may have less environmental impacts.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about, if there were any, some of the characters, and I'll underscore the word characters, some of the folks that you've had to deal with? I mean, some of them are legendary, some are not. Who have you interacted with that really kind of interested you and thought were interesting people?
Well, Lloyd Anderson of the Colorado River Board was certainly a unique character who, was a very effective representative for his constituency and a very colorful person. I actually liked Lloyd a whole lot and enjoyed working with him there. He probably stands out most of those in the Colorado River Board that I interfaced with there. Of course, within the Metropolitan Water District, Woody Wardasca came in, and an interesting relationship with the city of LA. A love-hate at times, but certainly I enjoyed working with him over the years.
You meant Lloyd Allen, I think,
I
from
meant Lloyd.
IID?
Yeah.
Okay,
IID.
good. Thank you.
And then, of course, I worked extremely closely and well with Ron Gustalem, who actually came out of the city of LA as a director on Met before he became general manager of Met. And so those are probably the most notable people that I worked with there.
Okay, and one more question that I have with respect to the relationship between DWP and Metropolitan, and I'll probably screw this up, but you can correct me. DWP is overseen, if you will, by a water commission, the Board of Water Commissioners, which is appointed by the mayor and the city council, so there are a couple layers of government there. But the city of Los Angeles also places, and you just mentioned Ron Gustalem, but they also place members on MWD's board of directors. So, how does that work? Do those people talk to one another?
Yes, no, and maybe. It all depends on the interest level of the administration. And unfortunately, one of the problems that I had as a top manager in DWP was you did not necessarily have the interest of the political establishment in water issues. Their issues were often broader political issues, of which water was a pawn that could be utilized to gain various other political chips, and particularly true at the state level. When we got up into Sacramento and you were dealing with political issues, you would see every representative of San Diego in lockstep with their cue card in front of them. And Los Angeles people were basically saying, well, if you give me my housing bill here, I'll support you on water over there. So it was a unique dynamic. Historically, the mayors during my time did not play that much of a role within the water issues. Jimmy Hahn had some interest. Reardon seemed to have very little, if any, interest in water issues. So DWP, basically was left alone, and pretty much as the policy guy within DWP, I had pretty much a free hand in terms of advocating or recommending directions. Now, clearly, I had to communicate what I was doing and why I was doing it and get sign-offs, but very little real involvement in determining what position should be taken by the city of Los Angeles. That is not true today. So things have changed. When I was there, basically the mayor appointed the DWP board, and those, frankly, were political appointments because that is the only appointment the mayor could make for people who didn't live in the city of Los Angeles. And so strong constituents. In fact, at one point we had, I think, 7 out of the 8 Met directors did not live in the city of Los Angeles, but were strong supporters of the mayor politically. So it was a political plum and a political appointment. But in turn, they had no background in water issues generally, and relied very heavily upon me for what direction they should take in terms of advocating policy within the Metropolitan Water District. The Board of Commissioners was another set of appointees by the mayor. And the two of them would meet very rarely, just to talk over common interests. But in essence, I formed the balance between the two of them. I keep them both informed of what we were doing, and obviously would have to answer if they had questions to either one of them. But the two of them did not have much direct interaction. In recent years, the mayor's office with Nancy Sutcliffe or Sudley, I can't remember the last name precisely, who's now in EPA.
Sudley.
But she was Mayor Villaraigosa's representative to both MWD. She was actually a MWD board member and also was his staff member that was responsible for all the DWP activities. And so the leadership really on the water issues moved into her camp with advice coming from the DWP staff to her, and then she in turn pretty much made the calls to both the DWP board, and who got a lot of direction from her, and then to the Met board as she was on the board.
Well, that's interesting. Well, what have we forgotten to talk about? Anything out there that, especially as it might relate to Colorado River issues or Colorado River Board issues? We've covered a lot of waterfront here.
Well, again, I think we've covered most of the water there, but one area we didn't talk about or didn't think about there is the long-term augmentation of supplies on the Colorado River. I'm not sure how much interest or energy there is in that at this point in time, but it was being considered at least as something worth looking at while I was there in terms of cloud seeding, augmenting the rainfall, looking at some of the vegetation schemes to see if you can get more of the runoff to come into play, and some of the relationships between the groundwater basins and the Colorado River that are not fully understood today in terms of making certain that we can get the water out of the Colorado River we plan on. One of the biggest concerns is the fact that the hydrologic studies were done during what now appears to be a reasonably wet period, and that in fact even the numbers that are claimed in the quantification settlement may not be reliable in the long run, and that we may have to deal with even less water in the future and have to go through some of the same machinations that went through on the quantification settlement to reduce those flows even further in the future.
You're talking about the hydrologic numbers that were used to establish the original allocations for Colorado River water. We're talking about 7.5 million for the lower basin and
7.5 for the
7.5 for the upper
and
basin.
1.5 for Mexico.
Right.
And those numbers, it appears on the portion of history we're looking at today may be high. And so while you have huge storage, Colorado River system has the benefit of having the two extremely large lakes that contain, 10 times the amount of storage containing the entire state project. So you have time to make adjustments on the Colorado system. But clearly, if we have overestimated the hydrology, over time you're going to have to find additional adjustments to be able to live within the water that's there.
Well, as those augmentation discussions were going on, and again we're talking about unusual things like cloud seeding and tearing out vegetation that was evapotranspirating water into the atmosphere. What were your thoughts as a member of the board? Were those good things? Were they valuable? Were they cost effective? Were they pipe dreaming?
Well, it was worth looking at. I don't think we had enough knowledge at that point to say yes, we should do it or no, we shouldn't. But you want to know what your options are. I've seen various studies on cloud seeding. For example, we historically have done cloud seeding on the Eastern Sierra under DWP's auspices, and we believed that we were getting something like a 2 to possibly 5% increase in precipitation during normal, slightly above normal years. In years of drought, if there's no cloud, you can't cloud seed. And the really wet years, you don't want to cloud seed because you don't want to create additional flooding. So you're limited to a band of years you can do it. But we did feel that based on the studies we looked at, that it was worth exploring in terms of just an economic return. Of course, there are those out there that are concerned, well, what about the silver iodide that is coming down to the earth and what are the impacts on the environment, so on and so forth. Again, obviously studies are required to make certain where it takes you. As far as the, again, vegetation management, what are the long-term implications? I wouldn't claim to really have a good handle on it, but I think that these are things that are worthy of study, so the future boards can make the right decisions as they face, the prospect of either trying to find some way to augment the flow or reducing the use of water out of the Colorado River.
Okay, very good. Since you retired in 2005. What have you been doing to have you stayed in touch with water issues? What are you doing to soak up your time?
Well, I have not played a major role in the water issues. I've suggested I could be available if people wanted to call upon me, but nobody has called. Uh, I, occasionally will go down and chat and give advice to my friends at DWP on the issues that are ongoing with Met, to still have contact with the people that are doing the Met issues. And I don't know, every 2 or 3 months may have a discussion with them over where it goes. I do keep up with the clip sheets on the water issues, although not as rigorously as I did when I was working. Primarily, I moved into the college career trying to bring along somebody to be behind me. So I teach about a half-time basis out of Cal Poly Pomona, and have been enjoying that.
Which is where you graduated from.
Which is where I graduated back in '67, so I've completed the loop. What's really fun is I have the course that I teach called Ethical Considerations for Science and Technology. And here I'm taking these seniors that have spent the last 4 years calculating everything out to the 10th decimal place, and talking about how do you really make decisions and what's really important as we look at our roles in engineering. And that has been a lot of fun. And then I also teach some of the water courses in hydraulics, water supply, and work with students in senior projects. So I found that very rewarding. Keeps me active. Keeping among kids keeps you young. And so I've enjoyed that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. This tape will be on file at the Colorado River Board. You'll be getting a copy, and DWP gets a copy as well. And I believe a fourth copy will go to the Colorado River Water Users Association, and it'll eventually get posted on their website. So anyway, we appreciate your time, Jerry, and thank you again.
Thank you, Jay.